The merciless sun scorched the rocky wasteland of Charon 7, the prison planet where only the strongest survived and the weak perished without ceremony or remembrance. Harry, a weathered 50-year-old with wiry muscles hardened by 15 years of exile, lay motionless behind a jagged boulder. His face was an emotionless mask, carved by suffering and solitude into something barely recognizable as human. His eyes constantly scanned the terrain with the calculated patience of an apex predator, seeing not beauty, but only threats and opportunities. Below him, a six-legged creature resembling an armadillo with toxic spines along its ridged back dug through the parched earth, searching for whatever subterranean organisms could survive in this forsaken soil. Harry watched it with disciplined patience, his breathing slowing to an imperceptible rhythm as he slowly raised his handcrafted spear. The weapon was crude but effective, a metal shard salvaged from a crashed transport ship, painstakingly sharpened against stones and bound to a shaft of hardwood with sinew stripped from previous kills. With practiced precision honed through countless hunts, he threw the weapon. It sailed through the dust-laden air and pierced perfectly between the creature's armored plates at the junction of neck and shoulder. The beast twitched violently, emitting a high-pitched keening that echoed across the barren landscape before going still. Another life extinguished on a planet that specialized in death. Without celebration or remorse, Harry approached the carcass, his movements economical and purposeful. He retrieved his spear with a practiced twist and hoisted the creature over his shoulder, adjusting to its considerable weight without complaint. The tough hide would serve for repairs to his shelter, the meat would sustain him for days, and the toxic spines could be rendered into poison for his weapons. Nothing would be wasted. Wastefulness was a luxury of civilization, and Harry had been beyond civilization's borders for 15 years. Harry's camp consisted of a crude shelter made of animal hides stretched over a framework of bones and stones beside a small cave that offered protection from the violent electrical storms that frequently ravaged the planet's surface. As evening descended, painting the sky in bruised purples and angry reds, he processed the day's kill with a sharp metal fragment, each movement precise and habitual as though he were a machine programmed for survival rather than a man who had once had hopes and dreams. The blood ran dark and thick over his calloused hands as he skillfully separated meat from bone, hide from fat, useful from useless. He had become part of this savage world, adapting to its brutal simplicity with a thoroughness that had erased any softness he might once have possessed. The flames from his cooking fire cast dancing shadows across his hollow features as he ate in silence, staring into the flames with empty eyes that reflected nothing of the man he had been before his sentence. Life on Charon 7 had stripped him of everything except the most primitive instinct: survival. 15 years of exile had taught him that emotions were luxuries he couldn't afford in a place where the slightest weakness meant death. Relationships meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant exploitation. Hope was a dangerous distraction that had killed many of his fellow exiles in their early years. The prison planet had reduced him to his most essential self, a creature that refused to die when death would have been easier. The next day, Harry walked along the rim of a deep canyon the local exiles called Broken Fang. The name came not just from its appearance, a jagged gash in the planet's surface that resembled a shattered predator's tooth, but from the distinctive howling sound the wind made as it raced through the narrow passages below, like the whistle through a broken animal's mouth. The sheer drop extended hundreds of meters below, a testament to the violent geological history of this forsaken world, where tectonic forces still regularly reshape the landscape with catastrophic earthquakes. Suddenly he stopped. His trained eyes had caught something anomalous in the terrain below. Far beneath him, nestled among the rocks and half buried by a recent landslide, he spotted something that didn't belong in this primitive wilderness. A small, damaged rescue pod that had crashed into the cliff face. Its sleek, technological contours stood in stark contrast to the rough, natural formation surrounding it. His curiosity piqued despite his habitual caution. Harry carefully descended the treacherous slope, testing each handhold before trusting his weight to it. Loose stones skittered away beneath his boots, disappearing into the depths below. One wrong step would mean joining them in a fatal plunge, but Harry navigated the descent with the confidence of one who had learned the hard way how to read this treacherous terrain. The pod's hull was dented and scorched, its emergency lights flickering weakly in a pattern that suggested the power supply was nearly depleted. The crash had been recent, perhaps within the last day, judging by the freshly disturbed earth and the still warm metal of the outer casing. Next to it, beneath the twisted roots of an uprooted tree, lay two small girls. Their skin was pale with a barely perceptible blue shimmer that marked them as definitely not human, despite their otherwise humanoid appearance. They were barely breathing, their small chests rising and falling in shallow, irregular patterns that indicated they were clearly at death's door. Beside them were two strange dogs with thick blue fur, the color of a deep ocean twilight. One growled softly at Harry's approach, baring teeth that were slightly too long and sharp to belong to an earth canine. But the animal was too weak to stand. Its legs trembled with the effort to appear threatening, despite its obvious exhaustion. The other merely whimpered, its large, intelligent eyes tracking Harry's movements with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Harry examined the children without compassion, merely assessing their value as he would evaluate any unexpected resource found in the wilderness. Their clothing, though torn and soiled, was clearly of fine quality, intricately embroidered with metallic thread that caught the light in patterns that suggested meaningful symbols rather than mere decoration. Their features were delicate, with high cheekbones and slightly pointed ears that confirmed their alien origin. He unceremoniously lifted the hand of one girl, noting the slender fingers and the unblemished skin that had never known labor. In her palm was clutched a small metal cylinder with intricate patterns engraved on its surface. Harry took it without hesitation, turning it over in his calloused hands. The contrast between his weathered skin and the cylinder's polished surface could not have been more stark, one shaped by harsh survival, the other by careful craftsmanship. "What kind of merchandise are you?" he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. The cylinder was clearly valuable, its material unknown but similar in weight and luster to precious metals. The engravings appeared to be some form of language or code, possibly identifying the owners or origins of these strange children. Harry tucked it into a pouch at his belt. Whoever these children were, someone would want them. In a universe where life was cheap, unusual life was often paradoxically valuable. The decision to take them was purely practical. Children, especially unusual ones like these with their distinctive blue-tinged skin, would be valuable to someone. The cylinder alone suggested they were important, perhaps important enough to barter for his freedom from this planetary prison. After 15 years of exile, Harry had almost forgotten what hope felt like. But the sudden possibility of leverage, of a bargaining chip, kindled something in his cold heart that he immediately distrusted. He constructed a crude travois from branches and strips of hide from his pack. The girls were light, too light, suggesting malnutrition or illness beyond simple exhaustion. He arranged them as practically as possible, securing them against the rough journey ahead with strips of cloth. The dogs watched him work, the stronger one maintaining its threatening posture despite its weakness, the gentler one whimpering occasionally as if pleading for care rather than abandonment. That night, the girls lay on an old hide in Harry's cave while he reinforced his shelter against the approaching electrical storm. The distant rumble of thunder promised a violent night ahead, and the rapidly dropping temperature would make exposure fatal for creatures as weakened as these children. The dogs positioned themselves at the entrance of the cave, watching Harry's every move despite their weakened state. Their loyalty to the children was evident in every alert turn of their heads, every suspicious glance at Harry's movements. Harry sat by his fire, examining the cylinder more carefully now that he had adequate light. It didn't glow or project anything as advanced technology might. It appeared to be simply a piece of strange metal with elegant engravings that wrapped around its surface in spiraling patterns. But its obvious quality and the care with which it had been crafted confirmed his initial suspicion. These children were worth something significant to someone powerful. People did not expend such craftsmanship on possessions meant for the insignificant. The firelight cast stark shadows across Harry's face as he considered his options. The most pragmatic course would be to seek out other exiles with communication capabilities, those who had maintained illegal connections to orbiting ships or hidden transmitters. He could send word off-world that he had found something valuable. But such individuals were notoriously untrustworthy, and Harry had survived in part by avoiding entanglements with the political factions that had formed among the prison planet's population. The next day brought the harsh reality of his decision. Harry dragged the makeshift travois with the girls lying on it across the barren plain that stretched between his territory and the distant trading outpost where he occasionally bartered with other exiles. It was exhausting work under the punishing sun, which beat down with malevolent intensity from a sky the color of heated metal. Sweat poured down his face and back, soaking the rough fabric of his clothing and stinging the various small cuts and abrasions that were the inevitable result of life in this harsh environment. He trudged forward without looking back, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for the dust clouds that would indicate approaching predators, or worse, other exiles seeking easy prey. The dogs trailed behind, stumbling occasionally but always keeping pace, their devotion to the children evident in their refusal to abandon them, despite their own obvious suffering. The smaller of the two girls, the one with slightly darker blue highlights in her pale hair, moaned softly in pain as the travois bounced over the uneven terrain. "Quiet," Harry snapped, not bothering to turn around. The sound might attract attention, and attention on Karen 7 was rarely beneficial. The moaning continued, rising slightly in pitch as the girl apparently fought through layers of unconsciousness toward awakening. Harry stopped, breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his face and stinging his eyes. He looked at the children as problems, obstacles slowing his progress toward the uncertain reward they might represent. The logical choice would be to abandon them if they became too burdensome. Survival on Karen 7 was about ruthless calculation, not sentiment. But something made him adjust the travois instead, smoothing the hides, to provide better cushioning and arranging a piece of cloth to shield their faces from the direct sunlight. He told himself it was practical. Damaged merchandise was less valuable. But the care with which he secured them belied this cold reasoning. Night brought biting cold to counterbalance the day's heat, a brutal cycle that wore down even the hardiest survivors over time. Harry sat beside a small fire, wrapped in his only cloak, a patchwork garment made from the hides of various creatures he had hunted, cured with primitive techniques that left it stiff but functional. The girls lay nearby on the hard ground, their conditions seemingly unchanged despite the water he had managed to coax between their lips earlier. The smaller one began to shiver violently, her teeth chattering with an intensity that seemed impossible from such a frail form. Harry tried to ignore it, focusing on the flames and the plans he needed to make for the journey ahead. But the sound persisted, grating on his nerves with increasing intensity until it seemed to fill the night around them. With an irritated sigh that clouded in the cold air, he yanked off his cloak and roughly covered both children. The immediate loss of warmth made his own body tense against the chill, but he set his jaw against the discomfort. "Just shut up," he growled, turning his back to them and sitting with his shoulders hunched against the cold, his body close enough to the meager fire to benefit from its limited heat without risking the flames catching his clothing. The older girl, who hadn't been sleeping, watched his broad back with her large dark eyes that reflected the firelight like pools of midnight water. There was no fear in her gaze, only observation, careful and calculating in a way that seemed beyond her apparent years. She pulled the edge of the cloak more securely around her sister, but continued to study Harry with unnerving intensity. By a stream the next day, Harry attempted to give the girls water directly from the clear, cold current. His understanding of their condition remained limited. They showed no obvious injuries beyond minor scrapes and bruises from the crash, yet remained largely unresponsive. As he turned the metal cylinder in his hands, considering what unknown value it might hold, the older girl suddenly became more alert, her eyes focusing on the object with sudden recognition. She crawled to a patch of damp sand at the stream's edge, grabbed a sharp stone from among the water-smooth pebbles, and began drawing with surprising coordination given her weakened state. Her movements were deliberate and determined, suggesting an intelligence and purpose at odds with her previously passive state. She sketched a large building with a spire, unmistakably a castle or palace of some kind. Next to it, she drew a figure wearing a crown, the simple lines somehow conveying authority and power. Then she added two small figures representing herself and her sister, the familial connection evident even in these basic renderings. A tall, dark figure with a sword appeared next in her drawings, looming over the smaller figures with menacing intent. This threatening figure was depicted offering a cup to the small figures, The implications clear even in this primitive communication. In the final drawing, the small figures lay on the ground with a skull-like symbol above them, the universal representation of death. Harry studied the drawings with growing comprehension, then looked at the girls more carefully, recognizing for the first time the similar features that marked them as siblings, perhaps even twins. He examined the engraved emblem on the cylinder, which he now realized might be a royal seal or family crest, rather than mere decoration. The pieces of the puzzle assembled themselves in his mind with disturbing clarity. This wasn't illness or injury causing their condition. It was poison, deliberate, calculated poisoning. And these weren't just any children. The crown in the drawing, the quality of their clothing, the valuable cylinder. They were royalty, perhaps even heirs to whatever system of power existed in their civilization. A chill that had nothing to do with Karen Seven's temperature ran through Harry's body. Political assassinations meant powerful enemies, and powerful enemies meant danger beyond the usual threats of the prison planet. He looked at the sky with sudden apprehension and saw what he had feared. In the distance, a ship was descending through the cloud layer. Its predatory, dark silhouette was unmistakable against the pale sky, the design clearly military rather than commercial, its lines built for function rather than aesthetics. They were hunting the children. And now, by extension, they were hunting him. Harry changed course immediately, abandoning his plan to reach the trading outpost. Such locations would be the first place hunters would look for strangers with unusual acquisitions. He carried the smaller girl, whose name he would later learn was Daisy, in his arms now, while the older one, Esme, held onto his belt, her steps wobbling but determined. He was no longer dragging them as cargo. He was leading them as charges under his protection, though he would have been reluctant to admit this shift even to himself. In the dense vegetation of the forest that bordered the stream, he found a purple, moss-like lichen growing on tree bark. The plant was distinctive, with a faint luminescence visible even in daylight that marked it as one of Karen Seven's native flora, rather than an Earth-originated species. Harry recognized it from the teachings of an old prisoner, a botanist sentenced for growing illegal substances, who had shared his knowledge of the planet's plants before succumbing to the bite of a venomous crawler 3 winters past. He gathered the lichen carefully, avoiding direct contact with his skin as the old man had warned, and ground it with water in his flask using the end of his knife handle as a pestle. The resulting decoction was bitter-smelling and unappetizing, but its medicinal properties had been proven effective against various toxins encountered on the prison planet. "Drink," he instructed Esme, who looked at the mixture with understandable distrust, her nose wrinkling at the pungent aroma. "An old prisoner said it draws out any poison. Maybe he lied, maybe he didn't. It's what we have." The practical assessment seemed to resonate with the child, who took the flask with both hands and sipped cautiously before passing it to her sister. Harry noticed how she tested it herself before allowing Daisy to consume it, a protective gesture that spoke of responsibility beyond her years. The girls obediently drank the bitter medicine, grimacing but swallowing without complaint. After some time, their fever seemed to subside slightly, the blue undertones of their skin becoming more pronounced as the unnatural pallor of illness diminished somewhat. That evening, they took shelter in a small cave formed by an ancient lava flow, its entrance concealed by hanging vines that provided both camouflage and an early warning system should anyone approach. The larger of the 2 dogs, whom Esme addressed as Varg in soft musical syllables that Harry assumed was their native language, suddenly began growling quietly, his attention fixed on something above their position. Harry moved silently to the cave entrance, drawing his knife and positioning himself where he could see without being seen. His heart rate increased, but his breathing remained controlled, the discipline of survival overriding the natural fear response. On a rock ledge about 100 meters above their hiding place stood a silhouette backlit by the setting sun. The figure was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be light armor that caught the dying light in dull gleams of functionality rather than ornamentation. Harry recognized the stance immediately, a hunter assessing terrain, a predator surveying its domain. This was Kale, the leader of the mercenaries who had been the first to land after the children's pod crashed. He simply stared down at their general location, making no threats, uttering no words. His stillness was more menacing than any aggressive movement could have been. The patience of a professional who knew his prey was cornered. Then he slowly raised his hand. In it was a small, shining object that captured the last rays of sunlight, a signal beacon of the type used for emergency extractions or marking locations for orbital pickup. Cal placed it deliberately on the stone in plain view. Then he pointed at the beacon, then in the direction of the cave where the children hid, and finally upward, toward the sky where his ship presumably waited. The message was absolutely clear without requiring a single word. Give them to me, take the beacon, and I'll take you off this planet. After delivering this silent ultimatum, Kyle calmly turned and disappeared behind the rock formation, his unhurried departure a statement of confidence. The offer had been made. The beacon lay on the ledge, its intermittent pulse now visible as darkness descended, tempting Harry with the possibility of freedom, real freedom, not just survival in a larger cage. In the profound silence of night, broken only by the distant cries of nocturnal predators and the soft breathing of the sleeping children, Harry stared at the beacon glinting faintly in the moonlight. Freedom. So close. After 15 years of exile, of fighting for each day's continued existence, of watching his humanity erode under the constant pressure of necessity. He could simply take the beacon, deliver the children to Kyle, and walk away from this hell forever. He looked at the girls. They slept huddled together for warmth, despite the small fire he had permitted himself to build. Their forms small and vulnerable in the flickering light. Daisy's face was pressed against her sister's shoulder, one hand clutching Esme's worn tunic. The other hand reached out in her sleep and grabbed the edge of Harry's jacket where it lay beside her, her fingers curling into the rough fabric with unconscious desperation. Harry froze, staring at her tiny hand. Something inside him that had been frozen for years, preserved like a fossil beneath layers of necessary callousness, began to crack. The sound it made was silent but deafening in his mind, the noise of a dam breaking, of defenses crumbling, of a heart remembering its original purpose. He raised his spear, its familiar weight balanced perfectly in his calloused palm. He took careful aim, measuring distance and wind with the expertise of a hunter who had survived by accuracy rather than luck. With all his strength, honed by years of struggle against a hostile world, he threw the weapon. It flew across the ravine in a perfect arc and struck the beacon squarely, shattering the delicate technology and knocking it from its perch. The broken pieces tumbled into the darkness below, taking with them the easy path to freedom. The choice had been made, not with words or declarations, but with action, the language Karen 7 respected above all others. Harry worked tirelessly through the night while the children slept, exhausted by their illness and the day's travel. He wasn't preparing for escape. He was preparing for war against hunters who had technology, weapons, and numbers on their side. He dug pitfalls disguised with carefully arranged foliage, their bottoms lined with sharpened stakes crafted from hardwood branches. He set snares with vines that would trigger deadfalls of heavy rocks. He arranged natural choke points where pursuers would be forced into predictable paths. This forest had been his hunting ground for years, and he was transforming it into a deadly trap for those who thought themselves the hunters rather than the hunted. Each preparation was made with methodical care. Each potential scenario considered and countered with the limited resources available. Harry had learned long ago that superior technology could be defeated by superior knowledge of terrain and the willingness to embrace brutal necessity. Dawn painted the forest in deceptively peaceful hues of gold and amber as three mercenaries entered the perimeter Harry had established. They moved with professional caution, but lacked the deep familiarity with the environment that 15 years of survival had burned into Harry's consciousness. The first man, scanning the canopy for signs of movement rather than watching the ground, fell into a concealed pit with a startled scream that was cut short as the stakes pierced his body. The second mercenary, momentarily distracted by his companion's fate, failed to notice the blue shapes launching themselves from behind a fallen log. Varg and Luna, seemingly recovered enough to fight, attacked with coordinated precision that suggested they were more than ordinary canines. The dogs targeted vulnerable points, hamstrings and throat, with an intelligence that spoke of training rather than mere instinct. From the shadows emerged Harry, moving with the silent efficiency that had made him the apex predator in his territory. His spear found its mark in the gap between the mercenaries' body armor plates, targeting the kidney with anatomical precision. The man collapsed without raising an alarm, his weapons falling from nerveless fingers as Harry lowered him silently to the forest floor. The third hunter, more cautious than his companions, avoided the obvious pass. But in doing so, he backed unwittingly toward a deadfall trap. The triggering vine caught his ankle, releasing a carefully balanced arrangement of heavy stones that crushed his helmet and the skull beneath it. The forest returned to silence, disturbed only momentarily by human intrusion. Kyle, more experienced and observant than his subordinates, eventually tracked Harry to a narrow gorge where rocky walls prevented easy escape. The mercenary leader had abandoned some of his heavier armor for greater mobility, but still presented an imposing figure with his height and obvious strength. A plasma-edged sword hung at his side, a technological advantage that could slice through Harry's primitive weapons with ease. "You've made a big mistake, Exile," Cale said, his voice controlled and cold as the night air. His accent suggested core world origins, his diction that of someone educated before turning to violence as a profession. "The children aren't yours to protect. They belong to powers beyond your comprehension." "This is my land," Harry replied, his voice rough from years of minimal use but steady with conviction. He gripped his weapons, a spear in his right hand, a long knife of salvaged metal in his left. "And you're a guest on it. Guests should show better manners." The implied threat hung between them, neither man bothering with further words. Both understood the language of violence that would now determine the outcome. A brutal fight began in the confined space of the gorge. Cale's sword hummed with energy as it sliced through the air, leaving faint trails of ionized particles in its wake. Harry's spear shattered on its second impact with the high-tech weapon, leaving him with only his knife and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Cale was stronger, better equipped, and likely better fed, but Harry used every advantage the environment offered. Loose stones underfoot to disrupt balance, narrower passages where Cale's greater reach became a disadvantage, overhanging vegetation that momentarily obscured vision. Severely wounded from a glancing blow that had opened his side and weakened by blood loss, Harry still fought with the desperate intensity of one who had nothing left to lose. He prevailed not through strength, but through unyielding will and the accumulated survival instincts of 15 years in hell. With a feint that drew Cale's sword in a predictable arc, Harry ducked beneath the deadly blade and drove his knife into a gap in Cale's armor, where flexibility was prioritized over protection. The blade found the vulnerability between reinforced plates, sinking deep into vital organs. Cale's eyes widened with surprise, and what might have been reluctant respect before the light in them dimmed. He collapsed slowly, the advanced technology of his armor useless against the primitive determination of a man protecting something beyond himself for the first time in years. Barely alive, his side bleeding profusely, and his vision blurring from exhaustion and trauma, Harry made the painful journey back to the cave where he had left the girls hidden beneath camouflaging branches. Every step was an act of will, every breath a reminder of damaged ribs and possibly internal injuries. The copper taste of blood filled his mouth, but he pushed forward with stubborn determination. The girls saw him approaching, his form stumbling and clearly injured. Instead of hiding deeper in the cave or fleeing while he was weakened, they emerged from their shelter and ran toward him. Harry tensed, expecting them to take advantage of his vulnerability, a natural assumption for someone who had survived in a place where weakness was exploited without hesitation. But Esme reached him first, her small hand touching his wound with concern rather than disgust or fear. Daisy embraced his leg, her arms barely reaching around his thigh, her face pressed against the rough fabric of his pants. The simple, unconditional acceptance of his protection, the trust these children placed in him despite having every reason to fear adult authority, broke something fundamental in Harry's worldview. He collapsed to his knees, partly from physical weakness, but equally from emotional overwhelm. For the first time since finding them, he embraced the children in return, his bloodied arms encircling their small forms with awkward gentleness. They were so fragile beneath his calloused hands, so trusting despite the cruelty they had already experienced. He made no promises, spoke no reassurances. He had been shaped by a world where words meant little compared to actions, but the embrace itself was a silent vow. As the sun rose on a new day, painting the brutal landscape in deceptively gentle hues of rose and gold, Harry sat outside the cave, treating his wounds with the limited supplies available. The gash in his side was deep but had missed vital organs, and he had survived worse injuries during his years of exile. He cleaned it methodically with water boiled with antiseptic roots, his face showing no reaction to pain that would have incapacitated someone less accustomed to suffering. Esme approached cautiously, offering him a flask of water she had filled from the nearby stream. The simple gesture of assistance was foreign in Harry's experience of Karen 7, where resources were hoarded and sharing was rare. Daisy followed her sister, carrying a piece of roasted meat from the previous night's meal, preserved for him rather than consumed by the hungry children themselves. These small acts of reciprocal care affected Harry more deeply than any grand gesture could have. On a planet where self-interest was the only reliable currency, where survival meant taking rather than giving, the children's innocent generosity was revolutionary. They had nothing, had been stripped of home and safety in nearly their lives. Yet they offered what little they possessed without calculation. They were still on a prison planet, surrounded by dangers, both environmental and human. The girls were still recovering from poison administered by their own blood relative. Their future remained uncertain at best, dire at worst. But in that moment, as the morning light bathed their improvised camp, they had formed something none of them had expected to find in this harsh place. A family forged not by birth, but by choice. Harry looked at the two small girls with their blue-tinged skin and the two blue dogs that guarded them with fierce loyalty. And on his stern face, weathered by years of struggle and solitude, appeared a barely perceptible, tired, but genuine smile. It felt foreign on muscles long unused to any expression beyond grim determination, but it reached his eyes in a way that transformed his entire countenance. He hadn't found the freedom he had once craved above all else. Instead, he'd found something far more valuable, a purpose beyond mere survival, a connection to something larger than himself. The days that followed tested Harry's new resolve with escalating challenges. The poison had significantly weakened the girls, and their recovery was frustratingly slow despite the remedies he concocted. Each morning he gathered more of the purple lichen, experimenting with different preparations to create increasingly potent concoctions. Sometimes he added the bitter berries that grew near water sources, known for their strengthening properties. Other times he boiled the mixture with specific roots that old prisoners had sworn could purge toxins from the body. Esme, whom he now knew as the elder twin by approximately 12 minutes, would watch him with intelligent eyes as he worked over their small cooking fire. Her gaze followed his hands with careful attention, memorizing his methods in a way that suggested she had been educated to observe and learn. Daisy, the younger and physically frailer of the twins, would often sleep during these preparations, her tiny body fighting the toxins that had nearly claimed her life. During her waking hours, however, she revealed a surprisingly resilient spirit. Attempting to stand and walk before her, strength truly allowed it, falling and rising again with stubborn determination that resonated with Harry's own character. Harry found himself speaking more than he had in years, his voice gradually recovering its forgotten cadences and tones. At first, his words were purely practical, instructions on which plants were safe to touch, which sounds in the forest meant approaching danger, how to move without leaving obvious tracks. But gradually other words emerged, rusty from disuse but gaining fluency with practice. He found himself telling the girls about Earth during quiet evenings, when the moons of Karen 7 cast their eerie, overlapping shadows across the landscape. He described oceans stretching beyond the horizon, their vastness dwarfing the meager streams of this prison world. He spoke of cities with towers that pierced the clouds, of technologies that would seem like magic to someone who had lived 15 years with only the most primitive tools. He told them of stars seen from a planet not shrouded in perpetual dust clouds, of constellations that had guided sailors and travelers for millennia. The girls listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide, as if he were recounting fairy tales rather than the factual past he had once inhabited. They asked questions that revealed both their intelligence and the gaps in their understanding. Esme wanting to know how ocean water differed from stream water, Daisy curious about whether earth animals were also blue like themselves, and their canine companions. These conversations, halting at first but gradually flowing more naturally, helped Harry reconstruct parts of himself he had deliberately buried to survive. The person who appreciated beauty, who understood concepts beyond immediate utility, who could imagine futures not dictated solely by the next meal or shelter. This person emerged slowly from the hardened shell of the survivor, like a creature long dormant, awakening to unexpected spring. The blue dogs, whom the girls called Varg and Luna, became Harry's unwitting hunting partners once they regained their strength. Varg, the larger and more aggressive of the pair, demonstrated tracking abilities that put even Harry's experienced skills to shame. The animal could follow the trail of underground burrowers by scent alone, leading Harry to their nests when other food was scarce. Luna, gentler in temperament but no less intelligent, seemed to possess an almost preternatural sense for weather changes. She would grow restless hours before storms arrived, giving Harry precious time to secure their shelter against the electrical tempests that regularly ravaged certain regions of the planet. Beyond these practical contributions, the dogs provided something Harry had forgotten the value of: warning. With their acute hearing and protective instincts, they created a perimeter of safety that allowed him to sleep more deeply than he had dared in years, knowing they would alert him to approaching threats. This improved rest accelerated his recovery from the wounds suffered in the battle with Kale, knitting his torn flesh and replenishing his depleted energy. More importantly, the dogs offered the girls comfort Harry could not. Luna especially seemed to understand when the twins needed emotional solace, curling beside them at night with a warmth and softness Harry's hardened existence couldn't provide. When Daisy woke from nightmares, increasingly frequent as the poison's grip on her mind loosened, it was Luna who would lick her tears and press against her trembling body until the terror subsided. One evening, as they ate around the fire, carefully consuming the meat of a six-legged herbivore Harry had brought down that morning, Esme began drawing again. This time she sketched what appeared to be a map in the soft ash at the fire's edge. Her finger traced a mountain range to the east, a jagged line of peaks that Harry had deliberately avoided during his years on Karen 7, due to persistent rumors of hostile indigenous tribes who viewed human exiles as invaders rather than potential allies. Esme pointed to the cylinder, which Harry now kept on a cord around his neck, both for safekeeping and as a reminder of his chosen responsibility. She made a drinking motion, then pointed to herself and her sister, before gesturing toward the distant mountains barely visible on the horizon. "There's something there," Harry said, understanding dawning. "Someone who can help you fully recover. An antidote to counteract whatever poison your uncle used." Esme nodded vigorously, her expression lighting with the relief of being understood. Daisy, sitting beside her, clasped her hands together in a gesture of hope, or perhaps prayer, her large eyes fixed on Harry with undeserved trust. The journey would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. The sensible choice, the survivor's choice, would be to remain in territory he knew intimately, where he could predict and counter most threats. But Harry found himself packing their meager supplies the next morning without hesitation or internal debate. If there was even a chance of the girls fully recovering from the poison that still occasionally caused seizures in Daisy and memory lapses in Esme, the risk was necessary. They traveled for days across increasingly treacherous terrain. The familiar wastelands gave way to rocky highlands where shelter was harder to find, and water sources were scarce but mineral-rich, leaving metallic tastes in their mouths and sometimes causing stomach cramps that slowed their progress. Harry fashioned a carrier for Daisy, who still tired easily, and strapped it to his back. Her negligible weight was testament to how much the poison had ravaged her small body, burning away reserves that should have cushioned her bones. Esme kept pace beside him with surprising endurance, her determination evident in every carefully placed step. She never complained, even when blisters formed and burst on her soft feet, unused to such travel. Harry found himself carving crude sandals for her from the tough hide of a predator he'd killed, creating soles thick enough to protect against sharp stones, but flexible enough to grip the treacherous slopes they navigated. The dogs ranged ahead and behind, acting as scouts and rear guards in an unspoken formation that maximized their effectiveness. Varg would disappear for hours, returning with information conveyed through body language that Harry gradually learned to interpret. Raised hackles meant predators nearby. Ears flat against his skull indicated human or humanoid presence. A relaxed gait signaled a clear path ahead. Luna stayed closer, often walking beside Esme as if cognizant of the girl's fatigue, occasionally allowing Daisy to grasp her thick fur for stability when the path grew particularly steep. On the seventh day of their journey, they encountered their first major obstacle. A wide river, its currents swift and unpredictable, swollen by recent rains in the highlands. The water churned with deceptive power, its surface broken by occasional whirlpools that indicated dangerous underwater formations. Crossing seemed impossible, but backtracking would cost precious days they couldn't afford, with the girls' condition still precarious. Harry spent hours constructing a crude raft, lashing together fallen logs with vines and sealing the gaps with a mixture of tree sap and plant fibers. He worked methodically, testing each connection before moving to the next, aware that a single structural failure in the middle of that current would mean death. As they finally pushed off from shore, Daisy clutched his arm with surprising strength, her eyes wide with a fear deeper than the situation warranted. "Water won't hurt you," Harry said, his voice gentler than he intended, the gruffness of years softened by genuine concern. "It's no different from the stream by our cave, just bigger. Keep your body low and hold on to the center log." Halfway across, disaster struck with shocking violence. A massive eel-like creature with armored segments and multiple rows of serrated teeth surged from below, its body easily twice the length of their makeshift craft. Its scaled hide gleamed with unhealthy iridescence. As it rammed the raft from beneath, capsizing it with deliberate malice rather than mere predatory instinct. Harry reacted with the speed born of survival instinct, grabbing both girls, one under each arm, as they plunged into the cold water. The current immediately seized them, spinning them in a disorienting whirl of bubbles and turbulence. He fought to keep their heads above water while being dragged downstream at alarming speed, away from the dogs who howled from the shore with frantic urgency. With his last reserves of strength, muscles burning with the effort, he thrust the girls onto a sandbar midstream, heaving them onto the relatively stable surface, before a particularly violent eddy caught him and pulled him under. The river battered him against submerged rocks, filling his lungs with water that burned like acid in his chest. His vision darkened at the edges as oxygen deprivation began to claim his consciousness. Then came an unexpected salvation. Teeth closed around his collar with careful precision, strong enough to maintain grip without breaking skin. Varg, swimming powerfully against the current with a strength that defied his size, dragged Harry toward the shore through sheer determination. Luna had already reached the girls on the sandbar and was standing guard over them, hackles raised against the water predators that might see the vulnerable children as easy prey. That night, huddled beneath a rocky outcropping, soaked and bruised but alive, Harry looked at the faces of the girls and dogs illuminated by their small fire. Esme was carefully drying Daisy's hair with a piece of their limited cloth, her movements gentle despite her own shivering. Daisy leaned against her sister with complete trust, her usual energy subdued by the near-drowning experience. Varg and Luna lay close to the fire, their blue fur darkened by moisture but their eyes alert, still on guard despite their exhaustion. For the first time in 15 years, Harry felt fear that cut deeper than mere survival anxiety. Not fear for himself, but for these vulnerable creatures who had somehow become essential to him. The possibility of their suffering or death affected him more profoundly than his own mortality ever had. It was a weakness by Karen Seven's brutal standards, yet paradoxically, it filled him with a strength of purpose he had never known, while fighting solely for his own survival. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised, the words emerging unbidden, his voice hoarse from swallowed river water and deeper emotions he couldn't name. It was a promise he had no right to make on this unforgiving world, but he made it anyway, binding himself to these children with words that carried the weight of irrevocable commitment. The mountain range loomed before them 3 days later, its peaks piercing the dusty sky like the teeth of some ancient, fossilized predator. The lower slopes were covered in vegetation unlike the scrubland they had traveled through, darker, more dense, with plants bearing wicked thorns and occasional flowers of improbable beauty and likely toxicity. Harry noticed signs of intelligent habitation almost immediately. Stone arrangements too precise to be natural, marks carved into tree trunks that followed patterns rather than random damage, small clearings that showed evidence of cultivation rather than natural formation. They were being watched. Harry felt it with the sixth sense developed through years of survival where being prey meant death. Eyes tracked their movement from concealed positions. Bodies moved parallel to their path, just out of sight but present nonetheless. Whoever inhabited these mountains was allowing them to proceed, for now, but could intercept them at any moment. That night, Harry instructed the girls to sleep between him and the rock face he'd chosen for their camp, with the dogs positioned at the perimeter. He himself slept lightly, his knife ready in his hand, waking fully at the slightest sound. Near dawn, when the sky had just begun to lighten from black to deep indigo, he sensed rather than heard movement around their camp. A subtle shift in the air, a deliberate quietness that was more alarming than accidental noise. He opened his eyes without changing his breathing pattern to find themselves surrounded by tall, slender figures with blue skin, much like the girls, but darker, almost indigo in the pre-dawn light. They carried spears with stone tips wrapped in some kind of metal wire that gleamed dully, and wore garments made of woven plant fibers and leather decorated with complex patterns that seemed to indicate rank or role. Their faces were marked with tattoos or ritual scarification that enhanced rather than detracted from their alien beauty. Harry rose slowly, positioning himself between the strangers and the still sleeping girls, his movements deliberate to avoid triggering an immediate attack. He held his knife low, ready but not overtly threatening, and assessed the group, approximately 15 individuals, all armed but not in aggressive stances. The apparent leader stepped forward, a female with intricate patterns tattooed across her face and down her arms, her bearing regal despite the primitive surroundings. "You bring the daughters of the enemy into our lands," she said in heavily accented common tongue, the universal language of space travel and trade. Her voice carried both authority and suspicion. "Why should we not kill you all where you stand?" "They're children," Harry replied simply, his voice steady despite being outnumbered. "They were poisoned by their uncle. They need help that I can't provide. If you want to kill me, that's your choice. But they've done nothing to deserve death." The leader's eyes narrowed, the vertical pupils contracting in the growing light. "Show me the proof of your claims." Harry carefully removed the cylinder from around his neck, moving slowly to avoid triggering the warriors who tensed at his movement. He held it out, not as a surrender, but as evidence. The woman took it with slender fingers, tipped with short, sharp nails that could easily become weapons if necessary. She examined the engravings with clear recognition, turning the cylinder to catch specific patterns in the light, then looked at the sleeping children with new interest, her expression shifting from hostility to something more complex. "The royal twins," she whispered, the words carrying a weight of history and significance Harry couldn't fully comprehend. "The ones they said were murdered in their beds. The ones whose deaths sparked the purge of our border settlements?" She knelt beside them, gently touching each girl's forehead with a gesture that seemed ceremonial rather than medical. Her fingers lingered on the barely perceptible pattern of blue veins visible beneath their skin, tracing connections only she could see. Then she looked up at Harry with new respect, reassessing him not as a trespasser, but as something unexpected. "You have carried them far, human, through dangers and hardships, when you could have abandoned them or sold them to those who hunt them. Why would one of your kind do this?" Harry found he had no easy answer that would satisfy either her or himself. The truth was complicated, a journey from self-interest to protection that he scarcely understood. "They needed me," he finally said, the simple words containing the essence of a transformation he couldn't articulate more eloquently. The leader nodded, as if this basic explanation was sufficient, perhaps even profound. "Come," she said, rising in a fluid motion. "Our healers will help them. You have preserved them through the worst of the poisoning, but they need our knowledge to be fully restored." The indigenous people, who called themselves the Ashkai, a name that translated roughly to "those who remember the before time" in their language, lived in dwellings built seamlessly into the mountainside. Their structures blended so perfectly with the natural rock formations that Harry realized they had likely passed several settlements on their journey without recognizing them as such. This camouflage explained how they had remained largely independent despite the prison planet's colonization and the various factions that had formed among the exiles. Their community was larger than Harry had expected, with hundreds of the blue-skinned people going about their daily tasks in a complex social structure that belied the primitive technology they employed. Many stopped to stare at the human and the royal twins as they were led through winding pathways to a circular building near the center of the settlement. The structure was distinctive, decorated with spiraling patterns similar to those on the cylinder, and constructed with a degree of mathematical precision that spoke of advanced understanding despite limited materials. Inside, elders with faces lined by age and wisdom examined the girls, with careful thoroughness, using methods that combined what appeared to be ritual with practical medical assessment. They crushed herbs Harry had never seen in mortars carved from single crystals, brewing potions that filled the air with strange, sweet scents that altered consciousness just through inhalation. For 3 days and nights, the healers worked in shifts, chanting in their melodic language while administering their remedies through various methods: drinks, poultices, steam inhalations, and ceremonial touching that might have been their equivalent of energy work, or might have had some biological basis Harry couldn't understand. Throughout this time, Harry refused to leave the girl's side, sleeping only in short bursts when exhaustion overcame vigilance. He observed everything with careful attention, memorizing the healer's methods in case he needed to replicate them later. They allowed this observation with tolerance that suggested respect for his protective role, occasionally explaining certain processes in simplified terms that acknowledged both his outsider status and his genuine concern. On the fourth morning, Daisy woke with clear eyes for the first time since Harry had found her. The clouded confusion that had marked her gaze was gone, replaced by alert intelligence and recognition. She looked around the healing chamber, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings with appropriate caution, then focused on Harry, who sat nearby watching her with barely concealed concern. Her face transformed with a smile that illuminated her features, a real smile of genuine happiness, rather than the confused half-expressions she had managed during her illness. "You saved us," she said, her voice small but clear, free from the slurring that had affected her speech previously. "When everyone else wanted us dead, you carried us to safety." Harry, exhausted beyond measure and emotionally overwhelmed by the simple statement of truth, could only nod, his throat tight with feelings he had forgotten how to express. Her recognition of his choice, the acknowledgement that he had acted against self-interest in their favor, affected him more deeply than any gratitude could have. Esme woke soon after, her recovery following her sister's, as it often did. The leader of the Ashkai, who Harry learned was called Nema, explained what had happened after consulting with the healers and examining the cylinder more thoroughly. The engravings were not merely decorative, but contained genetic markers and historical records encoded in a script that combined artistic beauty with practical data storage. The girls were the daughters of King Theron, ruler of the Celestial Dominion, a vast empire that spanned several planets and had once included the Ashkai homeworld before a disputed succession led to their ancestors' exile. The twins held special significance in Dominion politics due to an ancient prophecy regarding twin heirs and the restoration of balance between technological advancement and natural harmony, a rift that had divided the civilization for generations. Their uncle, motivated by both personal ambition and philosophical disagreement with the late king's moderate policies, had orchestrated a palace coup. Rather than risk the taboo of direct royal infanticide, which would have united various factions against him, he had poisoned the girls with a slow-acting toxin designed to mimic natural illness and sent them away in a rescue pod programmed to crash on the prison planet, making their deaths appear accidental while removing them from potential allies. He would not risk the spiritual consequences of royal blood directly on his hands, Nema explained as they sat in her dwelling, sharing a meal of unfamiliar but nourishing foods. Even tyrants fear certain taboos, especially those embedded in the collective consciousness for millennia. But he did not expect them to survive the crash, nor to find a protector with both the skills and the will to keep them alive long enough to reach our people. "What will happen to them now?" Harry asked, the question that had been growing in his mind since witnessing their recovery. With their immediate survival no longer in question, larger concerns about their future took precedence. Nema's expression grew somber, her tattooed features arranging themselves in lines that spoke of complicated political calculations. "The uncle believes them dead. That belief is their protection and must be maintained. Here, hidden among our people, they can grow strong, learn our ways and their own heritage. We can teach them the ancient knowledge their line has forgotten, the balance between technological power and natural harmony that once made the Dominion great rather than merely expansive." She paused, considering implications beyond the immediate future. Perhaps one day when they are ready and have gathered sufficient allies, they can reclaim their birthright. The prophecy speaks of twin rulers bringing reconciliation between the divided philosophies of our people. And what about Harry? Esme asked, now fully awake and sitting cross-legged beside her sister, her posture mirroring the Ashkai children, despite having been among them for only days. Will he stay with us here, or must he return to his territory? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications about belonging and choice that resonated with Harry's unacknowledged longing for connection. Nima looked at him, her ancient eyes containing a question that required an answer only he could provide. Harry gazed at the children he had carried across deserts and rivers, the children for whom he had rejected his chance at freedom, the children who had somehow thawed something within him he thought long dead. The logical choice would be to return to his established territory where he knew every resource in danger. The survivor's choice would be to go back to solitude, where vulnerability was minimized and attachments couldn't be used against him. But logic and survival no longer seemed sufficient organizing principles for whatever life remained to him on this planet or beyond. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words emerging with quiet certainty. "Not unless they want me to." The twins' faces illuminated with joy that transformed them from royal heirs to simply children who had found safety in a hostile universe. They moved to him simultaneously, their small arms encircling him in an embrace that communicated more than words could have. Harry returned the embrace with careful gentleness, still unaccustomed to touch that didn't involve violence or utility, but learning, slowly, awkwardly, how to accept and return affection that asked nothing beyond itself. Life among the Ashkai was unlike anything Harry had experienced in his years before imprisonment or during his exile. The indigenous people lived in harmony with the harsh environment, having developed technologies and techniques specifically adapted to Karen Seven's challenges rather than trying to impose external solutions. Their approach combined spiritual practices with practical innovations in a seamless integration that made distinguishing between technology and nature almost impossible. They taught Harry their ways with patience that respected his human limitations while acknowledging his survival skills. He learned how to harvest mountain plants for both nutrition and medicine, how to predict weather patterns from stellar configurations visible only at certain seasons, how to craft weapons that honored the materials from which they were made rather than simply exploiting them. In return, he shared knowledge gained during his years in the lowlands, information about exile movements and territories, techniques for surviving the electrical storms that ravaged the plains, methods of hunting the massive burrowers that rarely ventured into Ashkai territory but provided rich resources when encountered. The girls thrived in this environment of acceptance and learning. Esme revealed an aptitude for the Ashkai's complex language with its tonal subtleties and contextual meanings. Within months, she was conversing fluently with tribal elders, absorbing their rich tradition of oral history and storytelling with remarkable retention. Her natural diplomatic skills emerged as she mediated minor disputes among Ashkai children, showing an intuitive understanding of competing perspectives that suggested her royal heritage manifested in leadership qualities beyond mere birthright. Daisy, initially slower to recover physically, eventually revealed a talent for healing that impressed even the experienced Ashkai medicine women. Her empathic ability to sense imbalances in others led her to the appropriate remedies with uncanny accuracy. She spent hours following the tribe's healers, absorbing their knowledge of plants, minerals, and energetic practices with focused attention. Her previously fragile health strengthened under their care until she could climb the mountain paths with the endurance of children born to the high altitude. The dogs, Varg and Luna, became beloved by the tribe's children, who had never seen earth canines before. The Ashkai had their own companion animals, six-legged felines with limited telepathic abilities, but the dogs' unfamiliar behaviors and devoted protectiveness fascinated them. Varg established himself as a respected hunter, joining Ashkai tracking parties with a dignified acceptance of their customs that suggested unusual intelligence. Luna revealed unexpected nurturing abilities, seeming to sense when any child, Ashkai or royal, needed comfort, arriving silently to provide warm companionship during moments of distress. Harry found himself changing too, the transformation more profound for being unintended. His reflexive distrust of others, once a necessary survival mechanism, slowly gave way to cautious acceptance of community. His habitual silence evolved into selective speech, still economical with words but willing to share observations or experiences when they might benefit others. The hollow place inside him, carved by years of isolation and struggle, began to fill with something he eventually recognized as purpose beyond mere existence. But peace was an illusion on Karen 7, a temporary respite rather than a permanent condition. 6 months after their arrival among the Ashkai, scouts returned from the lowlands with disturbing reports. Ships had been seen landing near the crash site of the girls' rescue pod. Not the small, agile craft of mercenaries like Kale, but larger vessels bearing the insignia of the Dominion's military forces. The uncle had somehow discovered the twins' survival and sent not hired hunters this time, but soldiers, dozens of them, with advanced weapons, atmospheric craft, and tracking equipment designed to find specific genetic signatures. They have hair samples from the royal chambers, the scout reported to the tribal council, his expression grave. Their scanners can detect the presence of the bloodline across great distances. They will find their way here eventually. And they will destroy everything to get to them, Nima warned the assembled elders and warriors. The usurper cannot allow the twins to live, now that he knows they survived. And he will not leave witnesses who could spread the truth. That night, the Ashkai Council debated their options in the central meeting cave. Their discussion conducted in the formal mode of their language that emphasized consensus building rather than individual authority. Some suggested hiding deeper in the mountains, in ancient cavern systems known only to their most trusted pathfinders. Others proposed sending the girls away to another tribe across the Great Desert, distant relatives who maintained the old ways on an isolated plateau. A few voices even suggested surrendering the twins to save the community, arguing that the one-way prophecy wasn't worth the destruction of their current generation. Harry listened silently from his position at the edge of the circle, his status as both guardian and outsider, giving him perspective different from either the tribal elders or younger warriors. When all had spoken their thoughts according to custom, he rose, the movement drawing attention in a culture where physical communication carried equal weight to verbal. "I will take them," he said, his voice carrying in the hushed cave. "Away from here, away from all of you. Their fight is not yours. I found them, I chose to bring them to you, and the responsibility for what follows is mine." "No," Esme said, stepping forward from where she and Daisy had been sitting quietly, listening to their fate being decided. Though only 10 cycles old by the Ashkai calendar, she spoke with surprising authority, her bearing distinctly regal despite her child's body. "This is exactly what the usurper wants, to separate us, to isolate us, to keep us running until we are too exhausted to resist. We must stand and fight here, with the knowledge and protection of the Ashkai." Daisy nodded beside her sister, their physical resemblance heightened by shared resolve. "The Ashkai have protected us, healed us, taught us. Now we must protect them, with whatever power and knowledge we possess." Harry looked at them with newfound respect mingled with deep concern. They were no longer the dying children he had found beneath that crashed escape pod. They had grown, had learned, had developed strength of character he hadn't expected. But they were still children facing an army equipped with technology far beyond the Ashkai's stone and crystal weaponry or Harry's improvised armaments. "If we fight conventionally, we lose," he said bluntly, respecting them enough to offer truth rather than false comfort. "Their weapons, their numbers, their training, all advantages we can't match. But if we fight like prisoners, like survivors, we might have a chance." The phrase resonated with the Ashkai warriors, whose ancestors had survived the initial colonization of Charon 7 through similar asymmetric approaches. The tribal military leader, a scarred veteran named Koreth, leaned forward with interest. "What do you propose, Earthman?" Over the next 3 days, Harry and the Ashkai warriors prepared defenses unlike any they had previously created. They developed traps like those Harry had used against Kale, but on a larger scale, entire hillsides rigged to collapse, ravines disguised as solid ground, forest paths that channeled invaders into killing zones where Ashkai archers could target them from concealed positions. They poisoned water sources along the expected approach routes with toxins that would debilitate without killing immediately, ensuring the soldiers would carry the message of suffering back to their companions. They prepared ambush points and escape tunnels, always maintaining multiple routes for retreat and regrouping. The Ashkai contributed their deep knowledge of the mountain's secret paths and hidden caverns, while Harry brought the desperate innovation of a man who had survived when survival seemed impossible. Together, they created a defensive network that made the natural fortress of the mountains even more impregnable. When the soldiers came, advancing up the lower slopes in their regulated formations, they found not a village, but a killing ground prepared by those who understood every stone and shadow. The Ashkai knew every hidden spring that could be diverted to flood a ravine, every unstable rock face that could be collapsed with minimal effort, every toxic plant that could be processed into weapons against which the soldiers' medical technology had no prepared response. Harry had taught them the desperate tactics of a man with nothing to lose, the unpredictability, the willingness to sacrifice resources for strategic advantage, the psychological warfare of letting enemies see some of their wounded comrades return while others disappeared without trace. And the soldiers, despite their weapons and training, found themselves dying one by one in a land they didn't understand, fighting an enemy that refused to engage directly, but was omnipresent nonetheless. The final confrontation came at a narrow pass leading to the main Ashkai settlement, after 3 weeks of grinding attrition had reduced the invasion force to a fraction of its original strength. Harry, along with 20 Ashkai warriors armed with crystalline-tipped spears and bone knives hardened through techniques known only to their weaponsmiths, held the high ground above the pass. The remaining soldiers, now less than half their original number, gathered for a final push, their armor scratched and dented from previous encounters, their confidence visibly eroded. As dawn broke across the mountains, painting the stone in shades of amber and rose, Harry saw a familiar face leading them, Cale, who had somehow survived their earlier encounter, now wearing the uniform of a Dominion commander. The mercenary had apparently been recruited or conscripted to lead this mission, his knowledge of Harry and the children making him valuable despite his previous failure. A jagged scar across his face marked where Harry's knife had found its mark, a permanent reminder of humiliation that clearly fueled his current determination. "Surrender the children!" Cal shouted up at the defenders, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "This is your final opportunity. Do you think you can defy the Dominion forever? Every day you resist brings more ships, more soldiers. The full might of the Empire will descend on this backward rock if necessary." Harry stepped forward onto a projecting stone, allowing himself to be fully visible to the forces below. He carried a spear of Ashkai design, longer than his previous weapons, crafted from a mountain hardwood with a crystalline tip that could penetrate, standard armor at the proper angle. His appearance was much changed from their last meeting, his hair longer and braided in the Ashkai style to keep it from his eyes during combat, his body adorned with protective leathers decorated with tribal symbols, his bearing that of a man who had found purpose rather than merely clinging to existence. "Every day they grow stronger," he called back, his voice steady and caring. "Every day they gain more knowledge, more allies. You've already lost half your men to reach this point. How many more will die before you reach them? And what will be left of them when you do? The uncle's plan has already failed." Kyle's face contorted with rage, the scar tissue whitening as his features tensed. "Then we'll burn everything. We have orbital weapons on the support vessels. We can turn this entire region to ash. No more games, no more primitive traps. Fire will cleanse this mountain of your resistance." "You won't," came a clear voice beside Harry. Esme stepped forward, her blue skin gleaming in the morning light, adorned with ceremonial paint that marked her status among the Ashkai while identifying her royal lineage. Despite her small stature, she projected authority that silenced the muttering among the soldiers below. "Because my uncle needs proof of our deaths to consolidate his power. Ashes prove nothing. He needs our bodies intact enough to be identified by those who still question his version of events." Harry glanced at her with surprised respect. She had understood the political complexities of her situation better than he had realized, grasping the usurper's vulnerability despite her young age. The weeks of listening to Ashkai Council discussions had clearly developed her strategic thinking beyond what might be expected of a child. Cale hesitated, his expression confirming the truth of Esme's words. The slight shift in his posture, the momentary uncertainty in his gaze, these told Harry that the commander was operating under constraints that limited his options. "Leave now," Daisy added, joining her sister at the edge of the precipice. Where Esme projected authority, Daisy radiated something different, a calm certainty that seemed beyond her years, enhanced by the healer's markings she had earned through her work among the Ashkai. Tell my uncle you found evidence we died in the crash. Tell him you found our remains already consumed by scavengers. He will believe what he wishes to believe. Why would I lie for you? Kyle snarled. But the question lacked conviction, sounding more like a man seeking justification than truly demanding answers. Because the alternative is to die here, Harry answered simply, along with all your men. And you know it. To emphasize the point, hundreds of Ashkai suddenly appeared on the ridges surrounding the pass, their positions revealing how completely the soldiers were surrounded. This showing of force, carefully prepared in time for maximum psychological impact, demonstrated that the previous encounters had engaged only a fraction of the Ashkai's actual numbers. The soldiers looked around nervously, their discipline wavering as they realized the extent of their tactical disadvantage. Cal's face worked through a series of emotions, anger giving way to calculation, then to the reluctant acceptance of a professional who knew when a position was untenable. He recognized a losing scenario when he saw one, and whatever loyalty he held to the usurper clearly didn't extend to suicidal obedience. This isn't over, he said, the threat sounding hollow even to his own ears. The Dominion's reach is vast. There are other hunters, other armies. For you, it is over, Harry replied with quiet certainty. Return with your story of our deaths, live your life, and never come to this mountain again. That's the only offer you'll receive. They watched as the soldiers retreated, their formations tight and defensive, their weapons ready for an attack that never came. When they were out of sight, a cheer went up from the Ashkai warriors, the sound echoing from the mountain walls like thunder announcing victory. But Harry didn't cheer, neither did the girls. They stood in silence as the celebrations began around them, their expressions somber with the understanding that all three of them shared. This was merely a reprieve, not a final victory. The uncle would send others when Cale's report inevitably raised suspicions. The search would continue, perhaps with more subtle methods but with equal determination. As long as the twins lived, they represented a threat to ill-gotten power. That night, as the Ashkai celebrated with music and dance around great bonfires that could be seen for miles, a deliberate statement that they had nothing to fear and no need to hide, Harry found the girls sitting apart on a high ledge, looking up at the stars visible through a rare break in Karen Seven's usually clouded atmosphere. He'll never stop looking, will he? Daisy asked quietly, her perception cutting to the heart of their situation. Not as long as we're alive and could challenge him. No, Harry answered honestly, refusing to offer comforting lies to children who deserve truth. Not as long as his position remains insecure. Men like that don't know peace, even when they have everything they wanted. Esme nodded, her expression far too serious for one so young, yet perfectly aligned with her heritage and the responsibility it entailed. Then we need to become strong enough that when we face him, when, not if, we win decisively, we need to gather allies, knowledge, resources. We need to become what the prophecy says we can be. Harry looked at these children, royal twins with the blood of conquerors in their veins, and saw not victims to be protected indefinitely, but survivors who had already begun their transformation into something more powerful. Like him, they had faced death and refused its embrace. Perhaps their capacity for growth and adaptation exceeded even his own. It won't be easy, he warned, feeling obligated to ensure they understood the difficulty of the path they were considering. And it won't be quick. You're still children, regardless of your bloodline or destiny. Growing into the strength you'll need will take years. We have time, Esme said, with the patience of one thinking in historical rather than personal timescales. We have the Ashkai and their wisdom. And we have you, the one who chose us when choice existed. Harry felt the weight of their trust, their expectation. Once it would have crushed him with its responsibility, sending him retreating back to the simpler challenges of personal survival. Now it steadied him, providing the foundation for a life constructed around something larger than mere existence. Yes, he agreed, the word a covenant more binding than any formal oath. You have me, for whatever that's worth. It's worth everything, Daisy said simply, reaching for his weathered hand with her small blue one. It's worth life itself. Years passed with the steady rhythm of seasons that marked time on Karen 7 despite its harsh conditions. The girls grew from children to young women, their bodies developing the willowy height and graceful proportions of their species, while their minds expanded under the dual tutelage of Ashkai wisdom and Harry's practical knowledge. The indigenous people taught them their understanding of the planet's cycles, their connection to the land that went beyond mere survival to encompass a spiritual harmony, even with elements that seemed hostile. The Ashkai philosophy viewed adversity not as punishment, but as opportunity for growth, a perspective that resonated with the twins' experience of exile and threatened assassination, transforming into community and purpose. Harry taught them different but complementary skills: how to fight when fighting was necessary, how to hunt not just for food, but for information about the movement of others, how to endure conditions that seem beyond endurance through sheer stubborn will. Most importantly, perhaps, he taught them to question assumptions about limitations, whether imposed by others or by their own beliefs about what was possible. The dogs, aging but still loyal, protected them through various challenges. Varg's hunting instincts saving them during a season of unusual scarcity, Luna's weather sensitivity warning them before a devastating rock slide that destroyed part of the settlement. Their blue fur grayed around their muzzles, but their devotion remained constant, a reminder that family could be formed through choice rather than mere biology. Occasionally, search parties would arrive from beyond the mountains. Smaller, more cautious than the initial military force, usually disguised as traders or explorers. The Ashkai developed systems for identifying these interlopers quickly, and Harry would confront them in his role as a simple exile who had found acceptance among the indigenous people. His human appearance and knowledge of off-world matters made him a natural liaison, allowing him to assess threats while revealing nothing about the royal twins hidden within the community. The searchers would leave, sometimes with valuable information about other parts of Karan 7 traded for local goods, but never with knowledge of two blue-skinned girls living among the Ashkai. Eventually, the searches became less frequent, the uncle's resources presumably directed toward other priorities in maintaining his illegitimate rule. Perhaps he had begun to believe his own lie, that the girls had indeed perished in the crash or subsequent exposure to the planet's hazards. On the 7th anniversary of their arrival among the Ashkai, a ceremony was held that marked both remembrance and transition. Esme and Daisy, now 17 standard years old, were formally adopted into the tribe, not as guests or refugees, but as full members with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Harry watched with quiet pride as they received the facial markings of adult Ashkai, intricate patterns etched with natural pigments that enhanced their already striking appearance, while symbolizing their place within the community's structure. The ceremony involved vows spoken in the ancient language of the tribe, ritual consumption of sacred plants that induced brief but profound visionary states, and the assignment of adult names that would exist alongside their birth names. Esme becoming also Karasha, she who bridges worlds, and Daisy receiving the name Linara, healer of ancient wounds. That night, as they sat by the central fire consuming the feast prepared to honor their transition, Nima approached with a bundle wrapped in ceremonial cloth, its patterns matching those freshly applied to the twins' faces. Her own appearance had changed little over the years, the Ashkai aging process being significantly slower than humans. But her authority had only deepened, as her guidance had proven repeatedly valuable. "It is time," she said, placing the bundle before the twins with ceremonial gravity. "Time for you to know the fullness of your heritage and the choices that lie before you." They unwrapped the offering carefully, respecting the ritual significance of each fold and tuck in the covering. Inside lay two items that represented their past and potential future. The metal cylinder Harry had taken from Daisy's hand years ago, preserved now in a crystal housing that magnified its engravings, and a communication device of surprising sophistication. Technology far beyond the apparently primitive tools the Ashkai typically employed. "We have allies beyond this world," Nima explained, as the twins examined the objects with appropriate reverence. "Those who have opposed the Dominion's expansion into realms that should remain free, those who remember your father's more just rule, and the ancient covenant that balanced technological achievement with respect for indigenous ways. They have waited for this moment, watching for the sign that you had survived and grown into your potential." Harry looked at her with surprise that quickly gave way to deeper understanding. "You've been planning this all along," he said, not as accusation, but as recognition of a strategy extending beyond his own temporal perspective. "From the moment you knew who they were." Nima nodded, her expression neither apologetic nor triumphant, simply acknowledging reality. The daughters of Thorin were sent to us for a reason beyond mere chance. The universe has patterns, even in its apparent cruelty. What seems like disaster often serves purposes we cannot initially comprehend. Esme picked up the cylinder, studying it with new awareness, before twisting it in a specific sequence Harry had never attempted, having always treated it as a solid object rather than a mechanism. It opened with a soft sound of recognition, revealing not just the royal seal as he had expected, but a data crystal containing their father's last commands, his evidence against their uncle, his legitimization of their claim should they survive the treachery he apparently anticipated. "It's time to go home," Esme said, looking at Harry with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "All of us, to reclaim what was taken, not just for ourselves, but for all who have suffered under the usurper's rule." "Home," Harry repeated, testing the word that had lost meaning for him decades ago. He had not left Cairn 7 in 22 years, had adapted so completely to its harshness that the thought of other environments, controlled climates, population centers, the politics and intrigue of civilized spaces, filled him with a dread more profound than any physical danger he had faced on the prison planet. But the thought of letting these young women, his girls, in every way that mattered beyond genetics, face such challenges without him was even more unthinkable. They were capable, intelligent, and had absorbed everything he and the Ashkai could teach them. But the galaxy's dangers extended beyond anything they had encountered in their protected existence among the mountains. "All of us," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion he still struggled to express directly. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." 3 days later, a ship landed not in secrecy as the searchers had done, but openly on a plateau the Ashkai had prepared as a landing zone. It bore the insignia not of the Dominion, but of the Coalition, an alliance of independent systems that had long opposed the Uncle's expansionist policies and exploitation of resource worlds. Representatives disembarked, their varied species and formal attire indicating the diplomatic significance of the mission. They bowed deeply to Esme and Daisy, recognizing their royal status despite the Ashkai markings that now adorned their features. The farewell to the Ashkai was emotional in ways Harry would once have considered weakness, but now recognized as strength. The capacity to form bonds that transcended immediate utility, to value connection for its own sake rather than for survival advantage. These people had saved the twins, protected them, made them part of their community when strangers would have been justified in rejecting the danger they represented. Promises were made that the Ashkai would be recognized in any future government, that Cairn 7 would no longer be a prison planet, but a sovereign world with protected status, that the ancient wisdom preserved in their culture would be valued rather than dismissed as primitive superstition. Whether these promises could be kept would depend on challenges yet to come, but they were spoken with sincere intent by young women whose word had been tempered in adversity. As they boarded the ship that would carry them beyond the atmosphere of Cairn 7, Varg and Luna pressed close to Harry's legs, their bodies tense with anxiety at the unfamiliar environment of metal walls and artificial light. The dogs, now gray-muzzled and moving with the careful deliberation of age, had never seen a spacecraft before, had lived their entire conscious lives under open sky. Harry understood their discomfort intimately. He felt it too, the confinement, the separation from natural rhythms, the dependence on technology that could fail through malice or malfunction. Daisy knelt beside the dogs, her healer's hands gentle on their heads. "It's just another journey," she said, looking up at Harry with understanding of his unspoken concerns. "Another survival challenge. We adapt, as we always have." "The hardest yet," Harry replied honestly, giving voice to apprehension he would once have concealed. "Out there, I don't know the terrain. I don't know the predators or their habits. I'm as vulnerable as a child taking first steps." Esme smiled at him, confidence in her eyes that reflected not naivety, but earned self-assurance. "We've had the best teacher in adaptation," she said. "You showed us how to survive when survival seemed impossible. Now we apply those lessons to a different landscape." The ship rose through the atmosphere of the planet that had been his hell, and then his home for more than 2 decades. Harry watched through a viewport as the landscape receded, the mountains that had sheltered them, the forests where he had taught the girls to hunt, the deserts he had crossed carrying two dying children and leading two strange dogs on a journey that had transformed them all. The curvature of Charon 7 became visible as they ascended, its harsh beauty apparent from distance, in a way that was never clear from its surface. Storms raged across the northern continent, electrical discharges visible even from space, while the southern oceans reflected the light of the system's primary star. It was a living world despite its hostility, a place of struggle but also of possibility, much like the universe they were now entering. Harry didn't know what awaited them among the stars. Politics more complex than tribal councils, danger more insidious than predators, perhaps war on scales beyond anything the limited conflicts of Charon 7 had prepared them for. But as he looked at the twins, regal in bearing despite their simple Ashkai clothing, strong in ways that transcended physical capacity, compassionate despite having every reason for bitterness, he knew one thing with unshakable certainty. The universe was not ready for what was coming. A dethroned king had sent his daughters into exile as a death sentence. Instead, he had forged them into leaders who understood hardship from experience rather than academic knowledge, who valued community because they had nearly lost it, who could bridge primitive wisdom and advanced civilization because they had lived authentically in both realms. And Harry, the broken prisoner sentenced to a lifetime of exile, had found something he never expected in the wasteland of his punishment: a purpose beyond survival, a family formed through choice rather than chance, a future that held meaning beyond mere continuation. The man who had forgotten how to hope now stood with shoulders straightened by responsibility freely accepted, facing an uncertain future with the steady resolve of one who had already endured what most would consider unsurvivable. The girls stood at the viewport, their blue skin reflecting the starlight, their eyes fixed on the path ahead with the focused determination that had carried them from near death to this moment of potential. Harry stood behind them, protector still, father now in all ways that mattered, his hand resting on the heads of the aging blue dogs who had followed them across a world and would follow them across the galaxy with unwavering loyalty. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as victims of circumstance, but as architects of possibility, not running from a past that had nearly destroyed them, but moving toward a future they would help create, not merely surviving, but preparing to thrive in whatever environment the universe presented. If you like this story, click the hype button. This video deserves to be popular. Have a nice day.